Good morning, everyone. For today's sermon, I'll be speaking about the topic of mind over matter. And that's an age-old saying, and what it means is that when you apply your mind's willpower or focus, you can overcome physical limitations or challenges. And I was reminded of this that was finished. And that's a good example of how your mental approach can dictate the outcome. And of course, that resembles the principle in Aesop's tortoise and the hare. And a reference here in Australia, some of you might know, is the guy in the bottom graphic there, Cliff Young. That he won the was a 61-year-old potato farmer who won the ultra marathon from Melbourne to Sydney against much younger, fitter, better trained competition. And how he did that was he just kept running day and night, basically. 5 days. Tells us is that our mental approach and attitude can overcome a lot of difficulties and challenges, limitations that we may encounter live. And a favourite quote of mine, which emphasises the importance of our thoughts, it is on the screen, and it basically and not only our reality, our destiny, our alternate destiny, or as the graphic mentions there on the right, as Plato would have said, reality is created by the mind, by changing our mind. And the power of thoughts, the significance of one impure thought, or evil thought, or improper thought, is apparent in Genesis chapter 3, the fall. And of course, we know that Adam and Eve lived in paradise on earth. They were in direct communion with God until just one intrusive thought got in the way. And that evil thought was introduced by the serpent. And what that thought was, Eve wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. And of course, we all know how that ended, flooded and punished. And when we think back, that one intrusive thought introduced by the serpent not only impacted Eve, her actions, her character and destiny, but it also impacted on Adam, and ultimately for the rest of humankind that followed, but from one intrusive thought. So the significance of any impure thought we may have might not be as significant as Eve, but Jesus still makes it the seriousness of our thoughts very clear. And in the Sermon on the Mount, especially in the context of lust and adultery. And in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 30, it reads, "You have heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And your right hand causes you to stumble, and if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." And I'll just quickly note here that some of the verses we'll be looking at today refer to the heart. And in both Hebrew and Greek thought, they believed the heart was the center or responsible for emotions, thoughts, and our intentions. So we often see those passages referring to the heart, whereas now we consider that the domain and territory of the mind. So just bear in mind, when you see heart, it can mean mind. Exaggeration. So we don't take it literally, but it warns us against the nature of sin and the severity of hell. And a good way to think of it is we should amputate or cut off whatever it is in our lives that causes us to sin. Now, the same passage also instructs us that sin not only stems from our actions, but first and foremost from the desires of our heart and our mind. And that's whether we act them out or not. So, and that's, if you think about our thoughts, typically precede our act. I like David was said to be, a man after God's own man, after God's own art, if you like. And of course, the one note that is when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and that all stemmed from him gazing upon her when she was dead. That resulted in the death of Uriah and David's child with Bathsheba. And we can also see that with Samson and Delilah and having thoughts that can take you captive. Relates to lust and adultery. It is best served by an example, and there's a well-known meme, which is that graphic there. And it's basically, it doesn't hurt to look, does it? Right. So, but let's think about this example. So, an extreme example. So, say a man struggles with this, with his lust. He cuts off his hands so he can't inappropriately touch. He cuts out his legs and gouges out his eyes so he can't transport himself to avail himself of those opportunities, so he can't look upon it. And even if he locks himself in a cell and eliminates communication with the outside world, one thing he can't escape is his own mind. Okay, he may still be left there with the same lustful desires in his heart, in his memories. And the point here is just because you can't or don't do something in terms of physical action doesn't mean your heart and mind are in the right place. Okay, so if you think about the world's most undateable man, okay, he might be lacking in opportunity, but it doesn't mean he's lacking in mindset. So when we say does it hurt to look, yes it does if the thought behind it is not a pure one. And so just think, well, what if that guy's by himself and that lady turns around and looks back, goes up to him and gives him his phone number? Okay, yeah, this is how things start with a thought and then proceed from there. And that same mindset applies to all thoughts and impure thoughts. If you think of the 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, sloth, but they all begin with a mental approach towards an issue, which is generally later acted out. Some don't even need to be acted out. So for example, you can still be greedy, yet poor. You can still be a worker, but slothful or lazy in your approach to work. And so what I tend to tell my kids is it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. And a lot of that is to do with your mindset. How do you set your mind to approach issues is what matters most. And just an example, I think everyone in the world can relate to is, what was your intent? You think about a crime like, well, what's the difference between murder, manslaughter, and being acquitted? So, cold-blooded murder, first-degree murder, it's premeditated. You plan it out. you have nothing but hate and evil thoughts in your mind, which drive that act. Whether you proverbially pull the trigger or arrange for someone else to pull the trigger, it's the thought behind what you're doing that is heinous. Whereas manslaughter is better thought of as an unintentional or negligent act, which results in someone's death. You don't plan it out in advance, but greater care should have been taken. Because that should have been at the forefront. And if you plead insanity and think you're crazy, you're not in charge of your thought process. If you're under duress, you're forced. You know, we tend to present ourselves as best we can on Sunday, but within us all, we all have our own deep, dark secrets, thoughts that we keep to ourselves. We hide them away from others. But this doesn't make those thoughts any less impure in the eyes of God, whether we hide it away or not. And when you think of an addict, a gambling addict, an alcoholic, a drug addict, someone addicted to the internet, they always try to hide away their addictions, okay? Because they know that it's not right. And in fact, a lot of the darkest thoughts remain hidden in our minds. As an example, again, with lust, when you think about young men, what's one of the biggest addictions? Was known as the Murray Hill Riot, or Montreal's Night of Terror. So the police made it known they were going to strike, and that on October 7th, they would not be working. The whole police force went on strike. And so there was this big debate about whether people would remain civil and still obey the laws without the police working, or would that city descend into chaos and anarchy? And of course, without any police presence and no consequence to actions, there was widespread rioting and looting and everything else. And they eventually had to call in the army to fix that situation. So the question here is like, what would you do, or what would the average person do, if you knew there was no consequence to those actions? Okay, it's just a good question to ask. And, you know, but when you hold that mirror up to ourselves and our train of thoughts, it's a really good reality check. You know, and as a test, like, how would you feel if every single thought you had was put on TV for the whole world to see? Okay, that's our thoughts being televised. And the point here is that those verses there, Ecclesiastes, First Corinthians, and Daniel, you know, nothing's hidden to God. He'll bring everything out of the darkness and into the light. And he will judge rightly whether it's good or evil. And yeah, in Corinthians it says he will reveal the motives of the heart. What's driving us? The other thing we need to know is that the world isn't helping. If you can't resist the impure thoughts in the privacy of your own home, how will you resist that same impure thought when you're out in the secular world? And when we talk about a secular world which often encourages or endorses those same impure thoughts that, you know, that the Bible teaches us we shouldn't really be having. And one of the dangers is that we take too much pride, place too much value on our own thoughts, our own wisdom and ability to reason, rather than leaning on God and his wisdom. And that's one of the key principles in Job's when he questions God, because he thinks he's God's equal or something. What we also think about, as was mentioned last week, with Peter, get behind me, Satan. Okay, you're thinking not as God thinks, but of worldly things. And of course, we know that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and we can't think as God does. And a good example of that is when we think of the bottom verse in Genesis 6:5. Well, why did God destroy the world with a flood? It's because he saw how wicked the human race had become. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And, as an example, the Pharisees, they followed the laws very strictly, and outwardly, to everyone else, they looked very holy. But Jesus told them their hearts were far from God, which is why we can say it's not about following the law, it's about what lies within us. So in Matthew there, chapter 15, verses 7 to 10, and later 16 to 20. But the key point is it's not what we say or do, it's what comes from our heart it's what comes from it's what comes from within that defiles us. Okay, and what comes from our heart, as we just read it, generally evil thoughts. None of us is good. And in Matthew 23, 27 to 28, that's where he calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. They look good on the outside, but they're nothing but dead on the inside, full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Now, the other key point here is that when we think of our thoughts, or our desires that we have, it's those desires which give rise to sin. So in James 1, verse 14 to 15, it says, people are tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desires. We're enticed, we're tempted. That's what Satan is basically. He's a tempter. So he drags us away. And once that desire, that they describe as fully conceived, it gives rise to sin. And of course, the wages of sin is death. So we all know that saying, the wages of sin is death. What sin earns you is death. And what we learn about here is we trace that back to our desires, which come from within. Death, sin stems from our desires. We've also got that verse there in James 4, which basically says, but when we fight and quarrel, what happens when we desire something, we don't have it. It says there, you covet, and you don't have because you don't ask God. When you ask, you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Okay? So that all comes back to motives. What do we desire? What are we hoping for? And a prime example, and these all seem to be coming back to lust and sexual desire, but in Romans 1, 21 to 32, it's basically an example of what happens when we give in to our desires. And basically, in this case, a desire for a same-sex relationship. So the first two verses I'll just summarize. People reject God. And what that means, they place trust in their own thinking, which the Bible describes as being futile. It darkens their hearts, and what follows is idolatry. Verses 24 to 28. And so when people are left to follow their desires, it led to unnatural sexual immorality. And later on in those verses, it says the truth was exchanged for a lie. And people put themselves in place of the Creator. It's sort of like an arbiter of truth and goodness. In verses 29 to 31, when you give in to your desires, it says that their minds became depraved. And that gave rise to sins such as envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, arrogance, disobedience, and a lack of mercy. And finally, in verse 32, it says, not only did these people give into their desires and live a life of sin, they also approved and tacitly encouraged other people to do the same. And that's a nice little encapsulation of how our desires result in result in our own downfall. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy. And so I won't read this morning's scripture out. Basically, fighting their own battles. So firstly, we need to acknowledge that the struggle is very real. But nobody here is what the will is all about. The face about 10 within, generally speaking. And a good example of that, three notable things that be made new in the attitude of your minds and to put on your new self. Okay. So without that changing of the mind, but we're still stuck in our old ways. And one thing to note is that the truth is already within us. And that helps us put on the new self and into our minds, because the law is written on our hearts and on our minds. And that wisdom that comes from heaven, not the world, heaven, it is pure. And when our minds are renewed, it goes to work. And that work is evident in the fruits of the Spirit. And the fruits of the Spirit, the same with the seven deadly sins, some of those can be purely thought-based as well. Okay, they don't necessarily have to result in action, but the thought drives that the action is the point I'm trying to make. And so the greatest commandment, if we think about our thoughts in this way, in Matthew 23, 27, we can love God